sex, sexual health, sex education. Oh, what is she speaking? Are you someone wondering that right now? If yes, see, that's the problem. Talking about sexual health and sex education has always been a taboo in society, especially ours. Most people avoid talking about it openly, be it to kids, to teenagers, or adults, often leading to gathering up of misinformation through inaccurate resources on the internet. Hey everyone, this is Nupur. Welcome back to the second episode of Ignited Spirits Presents Leadership Series. Today, we have a young leader, currently a student of University of British Columbia, who is working towards ending the social stigma on sexual health through her organization named Prati Foundation. Author of a newly published book, Under the Carpet, she has tried to accumulate all her insights which she wished to have known as a teenager. Having been featured on platforms like Femina, In Youth, etc., she's trying to change the way people talk about sex, breaking all the barriers of the prevailing stigma. Bringing to you Niyati Sharma story, The Journey of Leadership. Let's begin. Hey Niyati, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on our podcast on Leadership Series today.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Firstly, congratulations on your book launch, Under the Carpet. How is the feeling after the book launch?
I think it feels still kind of surreal because I haven't been able to kind of see the book in person and hold it physically. So I'm really looking forward to that moment. But still, it feels good to have completed it. I've been working on it for the past year. So definitely a milestone for me.
Awesome. So moving on to the conversation. Let's start with the basics. Like when we see around, like when we talk about sex education from, in perspective of the people, most of the people have this misconception towards sex education, linking it to have it, like sort of encouraging them to have sex or, which is not true exactly. And there are so many myths apart from this. So what's your take on this? And what are some of the other myths that you want to burst out before the conversation starts?
Well, I think that, myths about sex ed kind of come from misunderstanding what the term necessarily means. I think it's also not really worded subtly, right, for our culture. Like when you say sex ed, it's kind of out there. But I think a lot of people confuse it for teaching young people the mechanics of sex or, exactly what happens. Or I think for a lot of people, when they imagine sex ed, it's very similar to the picture that comes to their mind when they think of porn, right? Which is so different. They're so different from each other, right? So I think that it's very important to understand where people are coming from. And it's very important to understand when we're dealing with different groups of people, everyone sees sex ed differently. So it's important to, before moving forward, before even starting programs, launching initiatives, I think teachers, stakeholders, nonprofit leaders, I think everybody kind of needs to be on the same page about what sex ed really is. And I think the CSE definition that was given by the UN is it's very comprehensive, it's very wholesome, even though it's quite a mouthful. But I definitely think it encapsulates very different and very important aspects of sexuality education. And I actually prefer the term sexuality education over sex ed because it kind of gives a more wholesome picture of what the education is looking to impart. So I think definitely that's one thing. And I think also a lot of people, when they think about sex ed, they don't realize that sex ed is not supposed to be the same across all ages, right? So what I talk to a 14-year-old about is not the same thing I say to a 10-year-old. It's not the same thing I say to a 20-year-old, right? So it's important to understand that like any kind of education, like maths, like science, like moral sciences, it needs to be age appropriate and it needs to be context appropriate, right? So it needs to be a little bit culturally sensitive. It needs to be aware of the different kinds of classes, the different religions, the different backgrounds, and the diversity you're dealing with whatever age group you're talking to. So I think those are some things that people don't really realize about sex ed, and that's where the misunderstandings kind of begin when we start to try and impart it in schools.
Yeah, I mean, there's another scenario as well. Like people, those who want to talk about it, but they're like how to start the conversation, how to initiate. That's another question that most people come across. So, how to initiate it, how late is too late, and where exactly the situation should be. So, what's your take on this?
So, see, I would say when you're talking about initiating conversations, it's different, right? So, for instance, me initiating a conversation with my parents will look very different from me initiating a conversation with my peers, right? It's usually much easier to talk to your peers, very easy to initiate a conversation there. But if you're talking about initiating conversations with parents, it needs to take a much more suddenly very indirect, very subtle route. You need to understand where they are coming from. Sometimes you have to meet them halfway before you guys can kind of move forward together. So I would say, like, for instance, back when I was younger, my parents and I never really openly talked about sex ed. I think most of my conversations were with my mother, and that too because she's a doctor, right? So it also always had this kind of medical, outline or underlying factor to it. But just starting simple. So, like, for instance, I would ask my dad, hey, when did you make your first girlfriend, right? Or when you were my age, were you interested in people? What did your school life look like? you know so kind of reminding them of what they went through when they were my age. And I think that helped them kind of connect, because every time I asked my dad, hey, did you have a girlfriend at this age, or did like a girlfriend ever do this, and he would be like, why did a guy do this, or are you interested in someone? He would kind of get the hint that maybe me or maybe my friends, or just that I'm at the age where these kind of questions are coming to my mind, right? So it has been more subtle, and then gradually we were able to build to a point where now, if I want to go out with my boyfriend, or if we want to go on a date, I don't like hide it from my parents. It's not like, oh no, I'm going to my best friend's house, which a lot of people still have to do. But thankfully, we've gotten to a point now over the years where I can go to my parents and say, hey, I'm going to hang out with my boyfriend, and they're like, okay, fine, just keep us informed, usual parent things. So I would say that it takes time to build that conversation. I'm not saying all parents are as receptive as mine necessarily were. And yeah, you just have to kind of keep at it, understand their ideology as well. I think with any group, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a parent, whether it's a friend, if you constantly kind of go at people like, no, 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 you have to listen to me, I'm right, what I'm saying is correct, and the way you think about the world is wrong, that'll only take you so far, because after some point people will stop listening to you because you're constantly challenging their beliefs. The point here is to talk to each other and to grow together, right? Instead of just kind of being like, no, you are wrong, you are absolutely wrong about everything in the world, right? We don't want that. So yeah, I think all we really need is a conversation. Sometimes it'll be more subtle to begin with. Sometimes, like if it's with friends, it'll be much easier, can be more direct as well.
Great insight. Now, moving on, let's hear from you, like how the journey of Prati Sindhi Foundation, indeed a beautiful name. Like I really love the name Prati Sindhi Foundation. Like how it all began, the journey, and working on social stigma from a very young age. So, yeah, tell us about that.
So I would say I think it's accumulation of factors. There's never really like one thing, right, that contributes. I think it's like a lot of different experiences that kind of come together, and you're just like, hey, this is what I want to work on. So I think for me, those few factors was one, definitely being someone who, saw young people engage in sexual activity at a young age, myself included. I think compared to a lot of my peers, I started engaging in sexual activity a little younger than normal. And, as I grew up, I realized there were so many things that I should have known, that I could have, maybe protected myself better, or just in general, things about boundaries and healthy relationships and red flags, which are kind of considered the soft skills within sexuality education. These are things that youngsters need to know, like when they're young teenagers, right? You want to start like as young as 10, 11 years old. And if possible, even younger, you want to start having conversations about consent when the kids are really young. Obviously, those conversations become more complex with time. But I think one was definitely that factor. The second was, of course, my mom being a gynecologist. I think her sharing her experiences, or cases that she saw, or just thankfully, being quite open about sexual medicine and sexual health definitely helped open up the conversation. And that's when I started seeing kind of the different side, right? Not the soft skill side, but more of the unwanted consequences, things like STDs, things like getting pregnant, and the kind of toll that those things can take. So I think definitely that. And I think, the final straw, I think for me that led to Prati Sanghi was when I came back from my exchange program, which was right after 10th grade. I spent a year in Belgium. And while I was in school there, they had this national survey. And it was all about, how sexually active are you? Which contraceptive methods do you use? And it was so weird to me as a 16-year-old, that people are asking me this in a school setting. I was like, are you sure they should be asked? Like, do the teachers know what's in this survey? And, why aren't they saying anything? So, and, that kind of got me thinking about, it's a good thing that they're having these conversations, because it's a great way to initiate a conversation. If not with your teacher, just everyone filling that survey in your class, by default, right after doing it, peers are going to talk to each other, right? Like, oh, hey, what did you answer to that? And it just starts like a conversation immediately. So I think it's a great way. And I think once I got back to India, it was really something that I wanted to take to schools, to institutions, and just kind of create a space where we could talk about sexual health without it being awkward and weird and judgy. So yeah.
Awesome. So you have been working on this cause basically when you were 18, right? Around 18.
Yeah, so I think we formally started when I was 17, and then we formally registered as a nonprofit when I was around 18.
Oh, great. So it's been like 3 years so far. Like, how challenging was it sort of to put it all together in terms of, there's so many challenges when you start something in these terms, like finding people who resonate with your idea, or maybe, framing that kind of team, or convincing people about your initiative, all kind of criticisms you face for this. So what was it exactly? Like, how difficult, how challenging was it?
I would honestly say I didn't even like realize a lot of the challenges were challenges, because sometimes you just get so engrossed in the cause that you just kind of go with the flow. And thankfully, I had my age on my side. So, I was still young and I wasn't so worried about, oh my God, we need to make money, or we need to get funding, or, this has to happen or that has to happen. I was still young. So it was just, for me, it was very, hey, I want to get out there and I want to do something. So, I think as you get older, so many other things start coming into your mind that hold you back. So I think thankfully, a lot of the things that could have been challenges were not, because I was still young and I hadn't really thought about those things yet. As for convincing people, I think, I had 2, 3 of my friends join in from the very beginning. And thankfully, I think they had similar experiences that I did. We were all in the same school. So we had seen our peers, we had seen, our seniors, we'd seen kind of the hookup culture, we'd seen the good side of it, we'd seen the bad side of it. Even if not directly, we'd heard about it, we'd heard rumors, we'd seen these cases happening in school. So, thankfully, at least with 2 or 3 of my close friends, one of whom is still in the team, even now, 3 years down the line. And, we just kind of began. There was no clear, oh my God, this is exactly what we're going to do, and this is where we have to go. Now, of course, it's more structured. We've had to kind of iron out those details, work in a more organized manner. But when we began, it was just an initiative. We made an Instagram page. We started putting out everything we knew and every piece of medically accurate information we could find. And then, slowly but surely, people did start joining in. I think the first time we opened volunteer applications, we had about 15 applications, I think, at most. Um, and now today we get more than 100 applications every time we open intake. So, there is a lot of interest, and I think it's amazing how many more people are getting involved in movements like this. And it's not just Prati Sandhi. Like, I see a lot more startups, I see a lot more nonprofits taking up this cause, which is absolutely amazing, right? The conversations kind of begun and we've gotten the ball rolling. So I think that's what's more important, really. And yeah, challenges kind of, they come and go. Sometimes you don't even realize that challenges until they're over, and you look back at them and you're like, oh, hey, this was not as easy as I thought it was gonna be, right? But yeah, no, definitely there's like ups and downs. And there have been times where I've also gotten frustrated and it's like, oh my God, it's a lost cause, but you just persevere through it. Even now with COVID, we face ups and downs, but you steadily work through it.
Yeah, because if you have that vision, no, then nothing else matters. Like we have to just
Yeah,
go through it. Yeah. So your
exactly.
organization actually works through whatever I have observed. It's like a workshop oriented approach, I guess. So how exactly is the structure of the modules like structured to ensure the right age group is able to sort of grasp the valuable insights, and how I also want to know the question like how is the kind of responses that you get in terms of feedback or questions from people which kind of differs with respect to gender? That's the second part of the
Mhm.
question.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's a great question. So for I think for a really long time we only offered standalone workshops because that's what was in our bandwidth at the time. So what we had done was we had curated important workshops and important topics that we felt kind of stand out for different age groups. So for instance, when you're talking about like 6 to 8 year olds up to say 10-year-olds, you've got themes like safe and unsafe touch and the very fundamentals of consent, which can be explained through like games or through engaging activities, or we use cartoon characters to help kids identify different feelings, what feeling unsafe might look like, how to gauge body language. So we used to use cartoons for those kind of things. And then, growing older, some other important topics that stand out are definitely puberty. You've got consent and communication, you've got healthy boundaries. And then, as you go to an older stage, you've got concerns like, pregnancies. You've got questions like how to prevent pregnancy, what are your contraceptive options, what are the different STIs, how do you get tested for an STI, and STI stigma. And definitely, only recently have we added this because we really worked on this module for a really long time. But definitely awareness about different sexualities, different sexual orientations. So we've broken down that as well. And for all of our workshops, we have an urban version, which is more targeted to English speaking students who belong to some kind of formal institution. And then we also have kind of a rural version, which is more targeted to, if we're going to say a slum, or if we are going to work with a nonprofit where awareness levels may not be the same amongst the audience. So, starting from the very fundamentals and making sure it's context appropriate, because, the problems that you find in different classes are very different. So, when you're talking about abuse or when you're talking about harassment, it can look very different based on the different contexts. So that's kind of how we divided our independent workshops. We still do independent workshops. They've largely been online for the moment. But we also do offline workshops. Just this March, we went offline and we worked with about 20 shelters across Delhi,
Wow.
spoke to about 700 women. It was a fantastic experience. So that is one aspect of it. And in the past year, we have also developed, especially since COVID came in, we've developed more long-term intervention programs. So, we have a 3-month program called the Bridging Gaps program, wherein we engage with the same group of students for a period of 3 months, where you're talking about different aspects of sexuality education and kind of building on that information over a period of time. Because I think it gives students space to talk about these themes that often seem independent of each other, but they're really not. They're kind of very connected to each other. So that's how we've been structuring it at the moment. The kind of questions we get, again, like I think it varies a lot by age. Sometimes questions will really surprise you. They'll lick your back. So, for instance, kids as young as like age 8, we had done a workshop on safe and unsafe touch, and we make them do this activity where there's like we give them a outline of their hand. Okay, so they draw an outline of their hand, and for every finger they kind of name somebody that they can trust, right? So somebody that makes them feel safe. And then, usually when we give examples for this activity, we give them examples like your teachers, your friends, or your parents, or, an aunt, a relative, a sibling, something like that. And I remember after one workshop, this one kid had asked us, like, what if one of my parents is not on my top 5 list? Which is surprising because that usually means something is wrong and something is going on. So, these things kind of surprise you, and then you have to know how to take that forward. So that was a standalone workshop. So we couldn't intervene in our capacity, but definitely taking that forward, communicating it to their teachers, because it was a school setup. So we let the teachers know that this is a question that we got, and you should maybe look into the students' performance, have a word with the parents, maybe get a counselor to speak to the children, something like that. So you have to kind of make sure that that's followed through, and we kind of kept a check in on how the kid was doing, and I think they're much better now. So yeah, I think questions can really vary. Very often they come from a place of personal experience. So even teenagers, very common question about boundaries is, what if I set a boundary and my friends are just laughing at me and they're not valuing my boundary? What do I do then? Right? Which is a common question. It's something we're also worried about. It's like, okay, I get that I need to set a boundary, but what if people don't listen to me? Then what? Right? So then it's, of course, about like following through on those boundaries, and how do you set consequences for not following boundaries, right? To make sure that whoever is involved is definitely sticking to and respecting you in those terms. So yeah, I think questions can really vary there. When it comes to diverse genders or diverse sexual orientations, I think questions have really been more about understanding the community, understanding the culture of the community. And thankfully, I think a very positive question that I've come across is how to be an ally. Like, maybe I don't belong to the community, but how can I be more respectful? How can I help? How can I be less judgy? How can I assume lesser and know better? So I think that has been a very positive change. And I think the whole attitude of, learning about the LGBTQ community as if it's something separate, I don't love that idea, because it kind of creates an us versus them, right? It's like oh, these people, how do I understand these people? They're not all that different, they're just people. So I try not to distinguish it that much.
Oh, awesome. Okay, so moving on, like I have this one question. One of the major problem that we see around us is the shame and the stigma by the usage of the cuss words attached to these private organs and sex in general, sort of to shame others and make others feel bad about themselves. So, what's your take on this, and what should one exactly do if one come across this scenario, sort of? So, what's your take on this?
Well, I think for one, if you're in a position to call it out, definitely, like when I see it around me or when I see my friends using such words, in a context where it's not appreciated or where you might be possibly offending someone, you need to call it out. Like, it's as straightforward as that. If you're in a position where you know better and you know that, okay, this person's body language is saying to me that they don't appreciate this, call it out. You don't have to be the target of it to call it out, right? And I think definitely, see, there's only so much you can control cuss words, right? You can't like put a ban on them or something. But what you can do is make sure you are teaching people what is respectful behavior and what is not. Very often people use these words between like their best friends and they don't mind, which, I mean, can be problematic, but what people do in their private sphere, there's very limited control that you can exercise on that. But what you can do is make sure you're keeping tabs on the media you're consuming. Very often we get these phrases, we get these words, these notions, either from what we see in front of us, the people we surround ourselves with, or we see it on media. We see it on social media, we see it in movies, we read it in books. So being a little bit more critical about the media that you're consuming, and definitely from a very young age, making sure that you're teaching children the right words for anatomy so that they know that, it's not something to be ashamed of. I think that's where these notions kind of start seeping in when, when you're teaching kids and if the kids are very young, I can maybe understand that, to explain concepts, you're mixing words up. But around the age of 5, 6, kids are old enough to grasp words, know anatomy, things like that. They can understand the difference between vulva, vagina, they know what a breast is. You don't need to always call it a chest. You can distinguish those things. Very often when we're talking to young kids, to explain, your reproductive organs, especially your sexual reproductive organs, people say, the area between your legs. Adding that level of ambiguity to it kind of creates this notion that it's something you're not supposed to talk about.
Yeah.
You can use it to explain or to illustrate, but at the end of the day, you have to get to the point and actually teach them the words.
Yeah.
Right. And that's how these words become destigmatized. I think that's where we kind of need to start, because honestly, by the time kids are like 11, 12, these notions have already seeped in. So you really have to start very young and have to start being critical at a very young age. And I think parents are an important part of that.
Awesome. So I'm right now very curious to know about this particular answer from you. Like, you are a student just like us, and how tough actually it has been, to manage this whole organization initiative, your teams, college pressure, both with respect to your past. The initial stage, which you already mentioned, but I also want to know, like, from the past to current, the comparison and sort of that, how it has been.
I think, honestly, I have the best team. I absolutely love everyone on our team because they're so helpful. And I've grown myself as a leader. I used to be someone who used to micromanage a lot. Like, if there was a social media post, I would be like, no, 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 this color is wrong, or this font is wrong, or this needs to be changed. Our logo needs to be bigger. That's not a good management style at all. I do not recommend it to anyone. It creates a lot of stress for you because you as a person, you constantly have these expectations that are not being met, which is because you're kind of trying to control everything, right? Which you can't do. You can't humanly do that. So it used to cause a lot of frustration for me. Slowly, I have kind of learned to delegate more because, as you grow older, you kind of have more responsibilities, more things to take care of. Definitely college was a big shift. In school, things were still manageable because, it's just school, it's fine. But with college, stakes are a little bit higher. So I think definitely learning to delegate has been something very important for me that I think has helped the team a lot, which was, personal growth that kind of affected the team as a whole. Because I see that the more I kind of let things go, let people handle things, the more they are able to take control of it. They feel more accountable themselves and they feel more involved, right? Because they don't feel like somebody's just telling me what to do. They feel like, hey, I can decide what I do. Right, which I think is important. I think it's so important in any kind of work. It's what I look for when I look for internships, or if I'm working on a project, this is what I would want. So it's something that I've had to learn. Sometimes I still tend to like slip back into micromanaging, but I try to pull myself out of it. And I'm like, no, 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 I shouldn't be worrying about this. So I think that has it's made a huge difference for the team. It's made a huge difference for me because it's made it easier for me to manage the team. And just because now I think everybody feels a sense of accountability to the organization and to the mission that we're working on. So I don't kind of have to run after people being like, nahi, nahi, ye karna hai, we have to do that. Of course, I help keep things streamlined, but there's not as much stress involved. And I think with COVID, we've really made it a point to stop competing, right? Even in the nonprofit sphere, no matter how much people tell you we don't compete, there is always an element of competition with other organizations working on the same cause, similar missions, things like that, which there shouldn't be, but there's always kind of an undertone, which is okay, but you have to kind of fight it. And I think with COVID, definitely realizing that you need to kind of take a step back and allow everyone else to take a step back. So I think for the past month or so, we've just been taking it very easy. We've been taking it slow, giving volunteers and the team and myself just kind of space to figure things out, you know, get things back on track. So I think that's been important because I think everyone knows someone who's had COVID, struggling with COVID, family members, facing shortages. So definitely people who can be involved, we make sure we keep them engaged. But if you can't be involved, there's no point pushing it because that's not going to lead to great results. And that's not how you create impact, right? If you yourself are not in a position to be engaging in a conversation, how can you expect somebody else to? So I think that's been definitely a shift for all of us.
Awesome. A big shout out to Prati and Sandhi's team if they're
Yes,
watching this.
yes, I
Okay.
hope so.
Yeah. Okay. So the next question is related to this only. Like, what sort of transformation you see in yourself, like coming out of your personal insecurities, that sort of you broke through doing, walking on this course in this 3 years. What sort of transformation you see in yourself?
Well, I think I definitely covered like the leadership aspect of
Yeah.
it. So I think that has been huge for me. It's given me a strangely new perspective on how things unfold and how to, plan interventions, how to strategize better, and just kind of look at the more human element of things. I've seen with bigger organizations, it's very easy to get caught up in the, this is how things are, this is how things have to be, and we just have to, things have to happen. That's a very corporate kind of mindset. And I just don't want to hold a nonprofit to that because we're primarily volunteer run. And I feel that the more space people have in a nonprofit setup, the better they, do, the better they engage with their own cause. So I think that has definitely been kind of one major shift. And I think another thing that I did not expect to learn actually, but I did end up learning is how to be very critical of everything that I see. So, of course, there are things that interest me more and some things that don't interest me as much. Like, I actively avoid the news, especially right now. It's not something for me right now. But, for instance, if I see a project report, right? If I see a mission or if I see a big organization undertaking a social intervention, I am extremely critical about how that unfolded. I'm critical about the words that they use. Because if there's anything I've learned about statistics is that they can be manipulated a lot. So, you can make things sound much better than they actually are. You can make impact sound much bigger than it actually is. So I think being very critical of the words that people use, how they present their works, and what they really mean when they say XYZ, right? So, for instance, if you have an intervention, this is actually something we also initially did not do, right? So whenever we used to do workshops, it was just a standalone workshop, and then we went, we talked, and we came back. Now we do kind of more consistent feedbacks. We do, hey, what did you know before the workshop? What do you know after the workshop? How much did you actually learn? How much were we able to get through to you? And that kind of helps us also work on our own interventions because we're able to figure out where are they lacking, right? Everything is not going to be perfect at all times the minute you launch it. It improves with time. The more feedback that you get, the more you're able to improve. So I think definitely being critical of everything I see and the interventions that I see around me, and just making sure that impact is not surface level and it actually goes deeper than that. And even if it's just one person who is changing their behavior in a more positive way, whose knowledge level has actually gone up in a measurable way, I think that is more important than just kind of going, delivering a one-way speech and coming back. So yeah.
Awesome. So let's now talk about your book, about like how for what it all contains and for what age group it's suitable or something you want to share. I'm really excited for this. Please share.
Yeah, so the book it's really just fundamentals of sexuality education. It's really things that I wish I had known when I was like a teenager. I wish somebody had given me this book and been like, hey, read this. So it kind of contains, it's a mix between personal experiences and also factual information. So it's definitely, I would say it's not for very young kids because it can be a little bit of a heavy read. It does contain technical words that may slip up for too young audiences. So I would say I think the best audience for the book would be students above the age of say 14. And honestly, with the experiences I've had working with university students, I would say all the way up to 25, 26 years old, I think this book could benefit everyone in some way or the other. I think older people might find, older students might find that there is information that they already knew, but they may get a new perspective on it. And it's definitely, I've tried to keep it as evidence based as possible. So every claim, every explanation, every reasoning, every myth, it's backed by research. it's been formally found, and it's actually supported by medical sciences, because I really don't believe in making kind of, open claims, even though they may be true. I think that it's good to know why certain things happen, right? Instead of just like knowing, acha, ye hai, to aisa hai. But rather than that, going deeper and thinking, hey, why is it this way? And why do we think about it like this? If something's problematic, why is it problematic? What are the kind of situations we don't even foresee teenagers ending up in that they actually do, you know? So I think the book kind of tries to give a new perspective to that, while also, of course, balancing factual information, evidence, and just the nitty gritties of technical things you should know, and trying to make them as simple as possible. So, yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, so almost we have come to the end, like the last two more questions. So this question is about your, major support system, throughout these 3 years. Who has been the major support system, on running this cause, on, how you naturally overcome your self doubts, sort of motivate yourself to work on this cause till now. What's the inspiration behind all this, Niyati's story?
I think so many people, like, there's absolutely no way I could do it myself. I think, for one, like, my close friends, my boyfriend, they've kind of been, unfortunately, at the, absolute front lines of when I get frustrated. The first people I call are them. I always avoid calling my team when I'm frustrated, because I know that it's usually misdirected anger, and I need to kind of calm myself down before I make any decisions. So the first people I usually call is either my boyfriend or my friends, or I speak to my parents. So, just right off the bat, I think those 3, 4 groups of people are extremely important. My parents, especially, so many things like, registering as an NGO, things like that, I wouldn't have been able to navigate if I didn't have them giving me a new perspective on things, or just giving me things to think about, right? Like, okay, hey, you're doing this, is it worth the money you're planning to spend on it? Just asking me that much gives me a lot to think about, right? So I think that has been really, really important. And I think definitely my team and our volunteers absolutely could not have done it without them. Sometimes, being in the nonprofit sector can be a little bit of a, you're kind of constantly giving, and there's very little often that you get back. It's usually in the form of, feedback, or you impacted a life. And I think that that's absolutely amazing. It keeps you going. But that sense of passion that you share with your team, and that sense of, passion that you can share with your volunteers, and I think when I hear from volunteers how much engaging with people helped them, and how much it changed their own perspectives, I think that really kind of keeps me going, because it's not one way, right? The whole point of having a youth initiative is not us going and saying, hey, we know the best, listen to us. No, it is actually going and saying, hey, this is what we know. Why don't you tell us what you know? And then we can probably improve on that together. So it's kind of a two-way learning process for our whole team, especially because everyone's a student. So I think that's been a really huge inspiration for me.
Awesome. So where do you look yourself, like, sort of mission, vision that you have for Prati Sandhi, like in future, or sort of in coming years? Where you look Prati Sandhi to be in coming years?
I think, for me, Prati Sandhi, I definitely see Prati Sandhi being in different cities across India. We're still navigating how to make that happen. Like I said, you have to be kind of critical about your interventions. Very often, you can launch something, 10 people join, and then once those 10 people leave, it's hard to keep it going. So you need to make sure you're expanding in a sustainable way, and when you're ready for it. So far we're taking it easy, also because of COVID. It's not the right time for an expansion, but hopefully in the coming years we'll be able to expand, take it to newer cities. Definitely working much more, in villages, working much more amongst the lower socioeconomic status groups, that are more vulnerable. I think that is a very important target for all of us. It's something I think everyone at Prati Santhi just feels very strongly about, especially after we went on ground in March. It was the first time some of our new volunteers went on ground since the pandemic began. And I think it was huge for all of them, the kind of conversations we got to have, the things we got to learn. So definitely taking it in that direction. And I think finally, really where we began was, making sure we're targeting schools and we're able to work with schools at a much larger level, but also in a much more sustainable capacity. So not just doing one-off workshops with schools, but actually having long-term interventions where schools themselves are able to learn, their students are able to learn, and the culture of schools is becoming more sex positive, less discriminatory, more equal for all the students. I think that would be a huge step for us.
Good luck for your mission. It's definitely going to work out.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. So, one last insight that you want to share with the audience, be it a kid, teen, or an adult, or a parent watching this or listening to this right now?
I think just, don't be afraid to learn new things. There's so many things that I've learned on the journey to Prati Sanghi, whether it's about nonprofits, whether it's about leadership, whether it's about sex ed, as a topic, as a theme. I've been able to learn so much. And I think sometimes you do need to put yourself out there, and that can be difficult. And challenging your own beliefs is always difficult. It makes you feel unsettled. But I think that that's a good thing. And, that unsettling feeling is what you should really be going after. And definitely just don't be afraid of that. Don't be afraid of questioning what you know. It might take you a little longer to truly absorb it. Sometimes it takes years to truly change from within. But I think if you keep engaging with things that you feel really passionate about or strongly about, I think you'll definitely be able to see new perspective to things. So just don't be afraid of doing that.